Hello and welcome to Inside the Vault. My name is Sandy Trenholm and I am the collection director for the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. And tonight we're going to be examining some documents related to the New Deal and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's second and third presidential campaigns. Joining me tonight is Allison Kraft, our assistant curator, who's going to tell us how to participate this evening. Allison?
Yes, first I want to introduce our intern this summer, Madison McManus. Madison was here with us last month, so if you were here last month, you'll see her again this month. She'll be helping me pull questions from the audience for Professor Perry. So if you see her, say hi. If you have questions for Professor Perry, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will be answering questions at the end of tonight's program instead of throughout. So ask your questions and we will gather those throughout the session. For safety, security, and privacy of everybody who is joining us this evening, microphones and cameras are turned off and the chat has been disabled. Again, if you want to talk to us, please use that Q&A feature.
Thanks, Allison. And also joining us tonight is Dr. Barbara Perry. She is the Director of Presidential Studies at the University of Virginia's Miller Center. And she's also authored or edited 16 books and is a frequent commentator on national and international media. And she was one of our scholars at the recent Gettysburg Symposium for Teachers. So thank you for doing that for us. It was wonderful. Barbara, would you like to say a few words to everyone?
Sure. Well, first of all, Sandy and Allison and Madison, thank you so much for putting this on this evening, and all those who are tuning in. Can't wait to see your questions and comments. And just thanks so much to the Gilder Lehrman Institute for American History. I just can't think of any institution that is just more not only fun to work with, but so gratifying because of the work that it does in collecting information, collecting archives, but also getting that word out through programs such as this. And I have been teaching with them for many years, both week-long professional development courses for teachers, and as Sandy said, most recently, the one that occurred just last month at Gettysburg College, and I'm teaching in the master's program for teachers, and we'll be having a course this fall on the American presidency. So thank you for having me involved in all of these programs, and I look forward to this evening.
Yeah. And if you don't mind, Barbara, we're working on a new traveling exhibition Gilder Lehrman will be having, I think, later next year on voting rights. So that'll be a really interesting opportunity for teachers to bring that exhibition to their schools as well.
Yes, and I'm also happy to say I'm working with Gilder Lehrman on that as well. We just had one of our first meetings about the content of that. And given our issues about voting these days, but also the history of voting rights in this country, the expansion oftentimes, but sometimes restrictions, we will be covering in this traveling exhibit. So that's another feather in the cap of Gilder Lehrman.
That brings us to tonight's documents. We have a lot on the agenda, but they all relate to each other. So what we are going to be discussing is these broadsides that highlight successes of the New Deal program. They were created specifically for the 1936 and 1940 elections. So they are campaign materials. We have five that are from Gilder Lehrman and 3 that are from the Library of Congress. So one of the great things about working for the collection is you actually get to physically handle the materials. And so these are very small. They're 12 by 7. So that's about the same size as a sheet of printer paper, but they're very thin and really brittle. They're highly acidic. So every time you hold them, and I'm going to ask Allison if she wants to chime in here, like they feel like you could damage them. So we don't actually handle them too much, right, Allison?
Right. Yeah, they're very fragile and very flimsy too. We don't shake them around, but they're very flimsy. And you know, we sometimes keep these in Mylar, which is like a clear, like archival safe plastic covering for them, because we are afraid that, you know, one wrong movement and it'll create a tear that could over time become worse. So we like to handle these as little as we need to.
And when you see on our copies, they had at one time been stapled together. There's holes on the top left corner on them. And our archivist very carefully took a tiny archival spatula and peeled the staples off to liberate them from their packages. And the other thing that's really cool when you're looking at these, and you'll have to let me know if you can see this on the one that says saved and the one that says our wealth of earth, It's really dark around the edges, and that's because the paper is so acidic, it's starting to burn the edges of the paper. So we actually house them in special acid-free, lignin-free folders that will draw the acid out of the documents and into the folders to help preserve them. So with that, I want to kick us off tonight by asking Barbara, can you give us a little background information and tell us a bit about Roosevelt?
Sure. Well, Franklin Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States, comes from the venerable Roosevelt family of New York State. There were two brothers who in the 1600s came from Holland, came to the United States, or came at that time to America, still the colonies, settled in what is now New York State. And one ended up settling in the Oyster Bay area outside New York City, and the other in upstate New York in the Hudson Valley, the Hyde Park Roosevelts, they are known as. And of course, Franklin Roosevelt sprang from that branch of the Roosevelt family. His wife, Eleanor, who would become First Lady, was actually related to the Theodore Roosevelt side of the family. Her father was the brother of Theodore Roosevelt. So she was an Oyster Bay Roosevelt. They were about fifth cousins. So it was kosher for them to marry. But Franklin Roosevelt had an amazing life. He had the confidence of an only child, born to a very elderly father who had been married previously, but his first wife died, and he remarried to a much younger wife, Sarah Delano Roosevelt. So that's the middle name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And she and the elderly father, who died when Franklin was a young adolescent, but they just adored their son, and he had all this confidence and self-esteem that only someone in that kind of family could have. So that really helped him through the first crisis of his life, which is in 1921 when he contracted polio at the Canadian estate that the family had in Campobello, and was able to overcome that and then become the governor of New York in the election of 1928, and of course went on to win his first of 4 elections to the presidency at the height of the Great Depression in 1932 against Herbert Hoover.
And that's a great lead into the next one. We have a couple of really quick timelines. I think it would be too much to put all of the information about Roosevelt into a 1-hour program, but we prepared a timeline that's just sort of the highlights of his presidential career. So could you tell us what we should be aware of as we head into this program?
Sure. That we want to be aware of when the Great Depression begins, and it is a worldwide depression, by the way, so somewhat similar to our own time in 2007 and 8, when we faced a worldwide seizing up of our financial system, and we did almost seize up completely in the United States, and as still the leader of the free economies of the world, that would have precipitated a worldwide depression. But there was a worldwide depression, started in this country in 1929 with the crash of the stock market on Wall Street. It also was accompanied by a climate crisis in the Midwest, the Dust Bowl, where people's farms just blew away. The topsoil just blew away because there was no program for conservation, no flood control. And so here comes Roosevelt into the midst of that. 25% of Americans were out of work when he took the oath of office. For the last time for presidents who took the oath of office in March of 33. After that, we went to the January 20th date. But he comes in with a real financial crisis and climate crisis right at his doorstep. And thank goodness is able to, through things like the New Deal, which we'll talk about this evening, is able to lift the United States out of the worst of the ravages of the Great Depression, go on and win a second term in 36, and then an unprecedented third term election in 1940 with World War II on the horizon for the United States, and then a completely unprecedented as well fourth election. But he dies sadly just after he's elected to that fourth term in 1944. He dies in April of 45.
So we're going to go on to the next screen where we have some information about New Deal programs. And we're going to cover some of these tonight in the documents, Barbara, but can you tell us just a quick overview of what's going on here?
Yes. So as I mentioned, 25% of Americans were out of work because of the Great Depression when FDR took office in 1933. And he promised in his campaign of 1932 to be an activist president for the federal government, unlike Herbert Hoover, who was a conservative Republican who did not believe it was the government's job to try to lift the country out of the Great Depression. And so in the realm of employment, farm assistance, conservation, works programs, social security. You name any element that could be connected to the economy in any way, including things like rural electrification to get development in the rural areas, not just through farm subsidies and that sort of thing, but really help to develop parts of this country that we would look at today and call the third world, that were not developed in this country at that time. So the New Deal is really the growth of the federal government to take over the social and economic system, short of socialism. Socialism is defined as the public ownership of the means of production, and that is not what Roosevelt did, but he certainly developed a strong administrative state and a very powerful presidency, and working in concert with his very large Democratic majorities in the Congress was able to pass through piece after piece of New Deal legislation, social economic programs to assist the country at that time. We should note that soon after these pieces of legislation would be passed and oftentimes regulating the economy and business and agriculture, some people who didn't want to be regulated would take these cases and end up all the way at the U.S. Supreme Court, which was very conservative at the time. And in the first term of Franklin Roosevelt, struck down well over a dozen pieces of New Deal legislation. And so we might mention that a little bit tonight, his tussle with the Supreme Court.
And then before we get into the documents, just so we know who all the players are, we'll talk about the two candidates that Roosevelt was running against in both 36 and 40. And the first one is Alf Landon. So can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yes, and thank you so much to Allison and Madison for gathering these campaign buttons, which I love. I have my own collection, but not nearly as I would say fulsome as the Gilder Lehrman one, to be sure. But Alf Landon was the governor of Kansas at the time that he ran for president. It was thought by early polling, and by that I mean polling was not very scientific or able to be done before the 1930s. And so one of the first ones that was done about a presidential campaign took place in 1936 by the magazine called the Literary Digest. And they did a telephone public polling where they called people out of the telephone book. The only problem for them when they predicted with much assurance that Alf Landon would defeat Franklin Roosevelt for re-election in 1936 was that many people did not have phones in 1936, and they tended to be working class people or poor people who voted Democrat and voted for Franklin Roosevelt. So he defeated Alf Landon by a landslide in 1936, and Alf Landon never sought office again after that landslide against him. But we should add that his daughter, Nancy Landon Kassebaum, went on to serve in the United States Senate and worked very closely, even as a Republican, with Democrat Ted Kennedy on things like healthcare reform. So his tradition at least carried on in politics, if Alf Landon did not after 1936.
How do you think, this is totally an opinion question, how do you think he felt about not even carrying Kansas in the election?
That's always a great blow, as one can imagine, to a presidential candidate not to win even his own state. Happened to Al Gore in 2000. If he had won his state of Tennessee, he would have defeated George Bush in that very closely contested contest, because he won the popular vote by well over 1 million votes. But as we know, he lost in a very slight razor-thin margin the electoral vote to George W. Bush. If he had won Tennessee, he would have won. Al Smith in 1928 did not win his home state of New York State. So it's always a crushing blow to be defeated in a landslide. But if you don't pick up at least your home state, you know you haven't done a very good job in campaigning.
Yeah. Okay. And then in 40, he runs against Wendell Willkie. So can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yes, Wendell Willkie, I think, is one of the more fascinating characters in American politics, and one who's not thought about very much anymore because he lost in 1940 to Franklin Roosevelt. He had been a Democrat for a good part of his life. He was a Hoosier through and through. He hailed from Indiana, but became a New York lawyer and businessman, and in some ways was more liberal. This was when the Republican Party, particularly in the Northeast, had a liberal wing. And he was a little bit more liberal in some ways than Franklin Roosevelt on things like civil rights. And so some members of the Black community, which had by 1936 had pretty much swung over to what's called the New Deal coalition that included Blacks. But some Blacks were unhappy with the slow pace of civil rights in the two Roosevelt terms. And so they swung over, some of them did, to Wendell Willkie. So he was very highly thought of, but still went down to a crushing landslide defeat in 1940 to Franklin Roosevelt, and sadly passed away in 1944. So if he had won the presidency in 1940, I'm not sure he would have even lasted to the end of that one term.
Is it unusual for a political opponent to become an envoy for the president who defeats him?
Yes, I would say that that's not very likely to happen. We do see, for example, even in contemporary times, people might recall the horrible tsunami that hit in the Far East in 2004 around Christmas time. And George W. Bush sent his father, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton, who had defeated him, to those tsunami ravaged areas of the world as sort of diplomats, and sending them from the United States to say, look, we really do care about you. Fast forward a bit, few more years, more recently, the terribly destructive earthquake in Haiti that we had. And Obama sent George W. Bush and Bill Clinton together to go to Haiti and again represent the United States diplomatically, but also bring supplies and financial aid to that ravaged island. And so I would say that in the most polarized times in which we live, it may become less likely, but I think those are two contemporary examples, and particularly after the vitriolic Bush v. Gore contest in 2000, that speak well for our country.
And that's going to bring us to our first document. And this one discusses home ownership. And I think if anything looms in the American memory, it's the foreclosure rate in the Great Depression, the Hoovervilles that spring up. So what is going on? Why are we losing our homes at that time? And what is this document talking about?
Right. Well, again, very much like in the 2007 and 08 financial collapse that we experienced, and somewhat most recently during COVID, when very many people lost their jobs, were let out of their jobs because of the shutdown. If a family loses its breadwinner, does not have a job, and cannot pay its mortgage, then the house is gone. And I mentioned as we prepared for this to my friends at Gilder Lehrman that this really has a personal meaning for me, because this happened to my father's family. And he was only, he would have been 11 years old when the stock market crashed. And his family had his dad was a working class bookkeeper in Dayton, Ohio, and they had just bought a very modest working class home. His mother was a homemaker raising 3 young children, but they just couldn't meet their mortgage payment. And my grandfather did not work steadily again from about 1930 to 1936, if you can imagine, 6 years without a steady job. They lived off my father's paper route in those times. And then thank goodness they weren't homeless in the sense that they didn't have to live in Hoovervilles, which were sometimes people living in cardboard boxes under bridges, for example. So they weren't put out onto the street as such. They could find members of their family to live with, but it was a horrible trauma. I'm not sure my grandfather ever really recovered from it. And my dad, because of it, was quite the saver. So this was happening to families all over the country, losing their homes, being put out on the street. There were not a lot of federal programs at that time to help in housing or for food. My father's family had to go to their city, to Dayton, Ohio, to seek foodstuffs. So that, combined with the crisis of the climate in the Midwest, with the farms blowing away, but also people having the mortgages foreclosed on for their farms, meant that people were losing their homes and their livelihoods in tremendous numbers. And this is what FDR pledged to do in 1932 election. And then these broadsides from 1936, you'll see that it says at the very top, save more than 1 million homes. That in other words, this was an attempt to help people who at least been able to hold on to their homes, continue to pay their mortgages. In the case of my father's family, that was too late for them. Their host, that my dad used to say in his oral history, our house was sold on the courthouse steps because they couldn't pay their mortgage. So for people who were already homeless, then FDR had to try to come up with solutions to get people into public housing, such as it was at the time, or start things like FHA, to get people to be able to get affordable mortgages. But my grandfather was really gun shy at that point, and for many, many years simply rented. He was afraid to purchase a home. And we know that in this country, home ownership has been a way to get into maybe from the working class to the lower middle class or even upper middle class if you can build some equity in a home. So just imagine all the people who didn't have that opportunity at the start of the Great Depression. So it is not a lie for this broadside from the Democratic National Campaign Committee for FDR for re-election to point out that he is saving people's homes. He is saving housing. He's saving the housing market as they get into that re-election campaign of 36.
I find it really interesting, and I'll point it out for people. There's this quote up at the top that says, "Be it ever so humble, there's no place like home." I have no idea if people still know that song jingle, but I remember it from being young. Do you know where that came from, Barbara?
I don't, but I will not attempt to sing it. I do know the tune, but I don't have the best voice, so I won't to cause people to flip off their sound. But I also remember seeing the saying in samplers or embroidered on pillows that people would put on their couches. And it also goes along with coming from the Anglo law tradition. A man, they would say in those days, a man's home is his castle. But there is something to be said for not only having the privacy of one's own home, but having the opportunity to have that home and again, build some equity, build some wealth in it. I don't think it quite looks like that, but that picture actually reminds me of the movie Miracle on 34th Street. If people watch that around Christmas time, and a very young actress, Natalie Wood, who pines to have a house, and she pines to have a house that looks like this, that she has seen in a magazine, because she and her mother, played by Maureen O'Hara, live in a very small apartment in Manhattan. And she just thinks what a wonderful thing it would be to have a home and to have a yard. And she says, and it could have a swing in the backyard. And so when my dad came out of World War II and having not had a home going into the war, but finally getting, 3 square meals a day and housing and clothing, his goal was to move outside of our hometown of Louisville into the country. And he couldn't afford a farm, but he could afford a very small working class home on a half acre. And to him, that was like having a farm with lots of elbow room.
Yeah. All right, we're going to go to our next set of documents. The one on the left is from 1936. The one on the right is from 1940. And they're discussing electricity, which at first doesn't seem like it should be a campaign issue, but it clearly is. There's both campaigns it appears in. So why is this so important for Roosevelt's re-elections?
Yes, well, if one didn't have a home, then one didn't have to be worried about an electric bill. But if people did have their homes and were able to hold on to them, it mattered to them if they could pay their electric bill. We just said that some people couldn't afford a phone in those days. So many of the utilities that we take for granted, and I'm sure everybody here knows, especially in the summer months, you have a thunderstorm come in, your electric gets knocked out. I don't know if you're like me, but I go around and I'm still flipping on the light switches, and I'm thinking, Barbara, the electricity is off. There's not going to be light, but we're so used to just at the flip of a switch having a light come on, or watching TV, or powering up our phones and our computers, that we're just very used to that. So if you couldn't afford your electric bill, and mind you, we were talking about this as we prepared for this evening, that in these broadsides, they say that the average electric bill around the country was a little over $2. So first of all, imagine that. But second, also think about that FDR said at this time, and this is what he was proclaiming and the party was proclaiming for him in 36, was that 9 out of 10 farms in this country, and there were 6 million farms in those days, 9 out of 10 farms did not have electricity. So he was touting his rural electric cooperative association that he helped to set up, and the dams that were being built under the New Deal, like in the Tennessee Valley, that were able to get hydroelectric power. So he says, in the Tennessee Valley, because of the TVA, as it was called, you now have electricity, and your average bill is $1.50. And then he expands on that in this broadside from the campaign committee of the Democrats in 1940 to say how many more dams had been built and how much more hydroelectric power. The other thing to note in terms of the third world that a lot of rural communities in this country would be compared to today at this time in the 1930s, in addition to the 9 out of 10 farms that did not have electricity, it said 75%, 3 out of 4 farm wives had to carry water. And by that, they mean there was no running water in the home. So no indoor plumbing for bathrooms, for toilets, for washing, for kitchen use, for drinking water. So this was another part of Roosevelt's New Deal, which was to develop the rural parts of the United States and bring them into the 20th century.
And this brings us to our third example, and it's about conservation, which I think is another one of those things when you think New Deal. I particularly think the Civilian Conservation Corps. So what's going on with this? What can you tell us about it?
Right, the Triple C, as it was called, or the CCC, we should note in a gendered way, at first was only available to men, but it was to help young men who were not able to find jobs, who had to leave school, sometimes in upper grade school areas or high school grades, to go out and try to find work. But they were just another mouth to feed to their families and they couldn't stay at home. So rather than have them living in Hoovervilles, or a lot of them were riding the rails, this concept of the Civilian Conservation Corps was twofold. One was to promote conservation around the country, to try to help, for example, those Dust Bowl farms that had blown away with land conservation, water conservation, flood conservation, flood protection, and then at the same time give these young men who lived in these camps out in the rural areas, or they also, by the way, procured and developed a lot of parks around the country. All of this meant that the country was going to be better off, people were going to be better off. But the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, came to her husband and said, how come only men are able to join the CCC? And so eventually women were allowed to join an equivalent of it and live in camps with other women and engage in some of these activities. As a little bit of a joke, those were called the she's instead of the CCC. But it was helpful for some women to be able to be a part of that too. It never was developed quite as well for them as it was for the men, but it was all part and parcel of this, both trying to find jobs, trying to find housing and food for people, especially young men, and again, to contribute to our country in the ways of conservation. It's really an add-on, I would say, in the theories of soil and water conservation to Franklin Roosevelt's cousin, the former president Theodore Roosevelt, who became president at the assassination of McKinley in 1901. And of course, he was really our first conservation-minded president. And nowadays, when we think of climate change and climate crises, and we see a lot of the impact of climate change in our country, whether that is with erosion or fires or severe heat and cold, hurricanes, tornadoes, this is really the first large federal attempt to make some inroads in that realm.
We have one more that's about the New Deal programs, and this one is aimed at business. And each of these, and there's more too, we have, I think, 9 available on our website. Each one's geared towards a different group of voters. This one happens to be aimed at businessmen. So what can you tell us about these ones?
Yes. Well, another gendered point, notice it says facts, Mr. Businessman. And I think it was the Beatles. Did they not have a song, Take Care of Business, Mr. Businessman? And in those days, without political correctness and with not a lot of women in the white collar business realm, that was not noted upon, even among some of the most liberal Democrats. But certainly Eleanor Roosevelt and those women she worked with in the highest levels of the party tried to at least get the word out about the issues that affected women. But certainly business people at the highest ends were never for Roosevelt. They could not even say his name. they called him that man. And I will hold up a book that is a memoir by Robert Jackson, who was his attorney general and then was appointed to the Supreme Court by Franklin Roosevelt. So the book is entitled That Man, but many of you may be aware that people in the highest levels of business believed, as Republicans, that the government should keep its hands off business. And since so much of the New Deal was an attempt to regulate business in order to try to relieve the ravages of the Great Depression, but also to help business, which if we look back at Roosevelt's legacy, while he was declaimed as being a socialist because of the government programs that he was proposing and passing through and sometimes having to repass after the Supreme Court struck them down, it is the case that as we look back, we realize he saved capitalism. So he did not take us down a socialist road as the political scientists define socialism, but rather, yes, he did expand the government to be sure, but he also saved capitalism to this day. He also, on the other side of that equation between business, usually business is on one side of the equation, business owners, those who are at the highest levels of the white collar system who make lots of money. And then at the other end is labor, the blue collar workers, the people on the assembly lines. And they were given opportunities under the New Deal to organize, collective bargaining it was called, in order to try to be able to come together as workers to have some kind of leverage to develop unions that could negotiate contracts with business. So while business never really took to FDR, certainly labor did and was part of the so-called New Deal coalition. Then, as Sandy mentioned, in 1940, to re-elect Roosevelt for a third time, saying to the business people, dry those crocodile tears. And well, first of all, what are crocodile tears? Well, those are fake or insincere tears. I actually looked up to make sure I understood the metaphor correctly, but apparently crocodiles, when they're out on land, do have some sort of liquid that comes out of their eyes in order to keep their eyes moist. And so those are called crocodile tears, but it's not because crocodiles have feelings or are sad. So to say someone is shedding crocodile tears means that it's insincere. I think business people sincerely did not like Franklin Roosevelt. But what the concept is in the broadside here, first of all, showing the Republican elephant with the tears, to say, oh, business, you should be grateful. Look at all the statistics that we can show you from the Democratic Party that Roosevelt has been able to accomplish in his first two terms, and therefore he deserves a third term. And one of the last ones I'll notice on the far right at the bottom was that finally it said by 1939 that business and department stores had gone back up to its 1929 levels. In other words, up to the pre-crash of the stock market levels. And that seems like a long time, 10 years, but it showed you the ditch we had dug for ourselves in the economy, and that it didn't mean that the New Deal solved it all. And in fact, many historians make the case, I think correctly, that it's really World War II that lifts us out of the Great Depression finally.
And before we move on, I was wondering if you could talk about these broadsides and if they make good primary resources to use in the classroom, because they seem to summarize the New Deal pretty well. But what do you think?
Oh, I totally agree with that. And you all know, if you're teachers, if you're students, how much you enjoy working with primary sources rather than to read about something in a textbook or even to listen to someone like myself talk about it. To be able to see these online and to know that you're seeing archives from that time is invaluable. And it's better than having to read. Now, by the way, recognizing that these are partisan for sure, because they're campaign literature. So some students might need to have that explained to them, or as Gilder Lehrman does, and we'll show you tonight, some of the other side. What's the Republican side from what the Democrats are saying in these campaigns? So it's important, of course, to get that partisan balance. But I think that we talked about this the other day in our preparation. These are similar, and I think students would really take a shine to them. And you could even have them practice tweeting about them. In other words, these to me are the forerunners of Facebook posts or tweets. And while they are partisan, they at least have information that's pretty reliable. But you might have students, for example, or if you are a student, and you say, well, this is partisan. I wonder if this is true, what the Democratic Party was saying about Roosevelt and all his accomplishments. Then you can yourself or have your students go back and look at sources, primary sources from that time to see if the statistics are correct and to see if the arguments are correct. But I think you can say that certainly better than a bot from Russia that now invades our elections via Facebook, that these are a bit more reliable than that. But I really do think they're the forerunners of, in some sense, social media today.
All right. And with that, we know that Roosevelt did run from a third term and a fourth term, but this particular broadside is from the Republican Party saying no third term. So what can you tell us?
Yes. Well, again, I love these buttons, out stealing third, making a baseball analogy, and Lincoln didn't, Washington wouldn't, Roosevelt shouldn't. And by the way, those are some of the things that are being said in this broadside by the Republican National Committee. They're pointing out that Washington could have run for a third term. Let's remember, there's no limit in the Constitution at the founding and at this time to hold a president to 2 terms. So the precedent was established by Washington. And they say at Mount Vernon, he could have become a king, but he was dying to get back to Mount Vernon and sadly did die not too long after he retired from the presidency. He could have had a third term. Jefferson could have had a third term. Jackson could have had a third term. Cleveland, of course, had 2 terms that were non-consecutive. And we are facing that possibility now with former President Trump. If he should run and win another term in office, that would be similar to Cleveland back in the 1880s and 1890s. But nevertheless, these presidents did not go for a third term. So the Republicans had a point that this was against American history. It was against precedent. Even the great presidents had not done it. And note the really nastiest button says here on the far left, Russia had what it called its Third International. Germany, of course, under Hitler, who had come to power, by the way, at the exact same time as Roosevelt in the winter of 1933, called it the Third Reich. And so they are making this sort of nasty comparison of the extremes. Is FDR going to be a communist? Is he going to be a fascist like Hitler? Is USA going to have a third term? And so always the argument against Roosevelt was that he was becoming a dictator. Even when he wasn't trying to run for a third term, conservatives viewed his increase in the power of the presidency and the federal government and his decision to try to pack the Supreme Court, even by some Democrats and some liberals, was viewed as bordering on a dictatorship. So that was the kind of argument that was being made in these broadsides by the Republican Party, and more succinctly, again, almost like tweets on these campaign buttons.
I'm going to point out something Allison and I talked about when we were getting ready today. Lincoln is one of her favorite presidents. And this one says Lincoln didn't. And she said, well, he couldn't because he barely made it into his second presidency, which I have to agree with.
That is a good point to raise.
It is a good point. Yeah.
Is it not? Yeah. And of course, then because of the backlash by the Republicans after Roosevelt dies, in 1945, by 1947, Congress passes what becomes the 22nd Amendment in the early 1950s, requiring that there only be 2 terms for a president unless someone has succeeded to the presidency at the resignation or death of a president. But altogether, no president can serve more than 10 years.
And before we move on to our final document, what made Roosevelt so electable and re-electable over and over again?
Oh, I would say a host of things. One was what we started with tonight, that sense of confidence, that sense of supreme self-esteem, but without seeming to be arrogant about it, charismatic. He is the first real electronic president. And not only, I don't mean but by electrifying America, literally, but he was electrifying in his speaking. I'm sure people have heard of his fireside chat. So he's really the first radio president who makes radio a tool of running for office and being in office. So that his first fireside address comes just a few days after his inauguration in March of 1933. And if people should listen to it, they can just click on it online and listen to it. He just talks so openly and so comfortingly to the American people and says, I'm going to have to close the banks. I'm declaring a bank holiday because so many of them are going under. And part of what happens, and back to Christmas movies, if you watch It's a Wonderful Life, you see Jimmy Stewart's savings and loan having what they call a run on the bank. If you're afraid that the bank is going to shut down and you're going to lose your money, what do people do but run to the bank, take all their money out? Well, what does that do? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. The bank has to close because it has no more assets. So Roosevelt explains to the people what he's doing and then says, if you'll just be patient with me, that we'll get the banks back. We'll get the banks back on their feet and your savings will be safe. And he succeeds at that. He had this comforting way about him, a comforting voice to him. And as was said about him by, I think it was Churchill, that meeting Roosevelt for the first time, he said, was like uncorking your first bottle of champagne. In other words, there was this effervescence about him that until his health began to fail at the end of his third term and certainly into the fourth when he died, there was just this ebullience about him. And the fact that he had overcome polio, that people saw that he represented overcoming hardship. And so that's what made him so electable and quite frankly, so beloved. So that if you watch the pictures, the videos, the still photographs when he died at Warm Springs in 1945, there's a famous photograph of a Black man playing the song Going Home on the accordion with tears streaming down his face. And then when the president's coffin was brought back to Washington and paraded through the streets of Washington back to the White House, there's a picture of a Black woman, tears streaming down her face, and she's waving her handkerchief at him. And again, I can remember my parents saying they had never known any other president. They were young adolescents when he came to power, and they were in their 20s in the midst of World War II when he died. And they wondered, how would the country go on without him? So all of these combinations of his personality, his a belief in the American way, his belief in American business, his belief in the American people, and 2/3 of them felt that. 1/3 never did and really, quite frankly, hated him. But 2/3, you only need a majority or sometimes even a plurality to win. So that explains his electability over such a long time. And the fact that along with Lincoln and Washington, he always comes out at the top of the greatest presidents polls when scholars are polled about who are the greatest presidents.
And it seems that the presidents who come out on top are the most memorable are also the best speakers and speech writers, right? They have the best words that live on. I'm going to say something that's completely.
I would add, Washington, I think, wasn't viewed as a great speech maker, but he had all these other elements that we're saying that certainly Roosevelt had. And yes, he had good speech writers, but you can't just have a good speech writer. You have to be able to deliver a speech well, which Roosevelt could. And obviously in the case of Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address, himself writes the greatest American speech ever, in my view. So they all have something that puts them head and shoulders above the rest, and they save the country. In the case of Washington, he saves us at the beginning. We could have not been successful. He saves us at the beginning. Lincoln saves us during the Civil War. And FDR saves us from two crises, the Great Depression and World War II.
Allison, I'm going to ask you a question, because it might be just me, but the layout on this broadside is exactly the same one as why women should vote. It's exactly the same. Instead of saying why women should vote at the top, it says no third term, but that one has because running down the side. Yeah. And then a sentence or two about why women should vote. It's almost exactly identical.
It is. And I'm going to put that session of Inside the Vault about women's suffrage in the chat for folks to take a look at it if they want. And you can look at more examples of broadsheets that we have in the collection and how effective they were in getting the message across. And it's just that repetitive nature, I think, really is attempting and perhaps succeeding on some level with some people in making the message clear and driving it home. People didn't want Roosevelt to be president again, but some people did, and there we go.
And that's what our last broadside about. And this is the Democrats' response to the Republicans' concerns. So, Barbara, what's going on here?
Yes. Oh, that concept of the bugaboo. We don't hear that word so much anymore. It's sort of like balderdash or poppycock, or what is it that Scrooge says, humbug. They're words like that that were more popular in those days. But a bugaboo is something that's just false, something that's made up. And so what the Democrats are saying is all of these reasons the Republicans are giving for not electing Roosevelt for a third time it's balderdash and poppycock, or I guess some would say BS now. and their argument is that all of this point about, oh, well, there's no precedent for this, and the greatest presidents didn't engage in an attempt to run for a third term. That's just precedent. There's nothing in the Constitution that bans a president from running for a third term. Their point in all of these broadsheets is that look at all that Roosevelt did for the country in the first two terms. But notice, if you zero in on this sheet, that what is causing the Democrats to make their case is what's happening now in the rest of the world. And that is that World War II begins in Europe with the Nazi invasion of Poland in September of 1939. So just a year before this 1940 election. And World War II is underway in the Pacific theater because of the aggression of the Japanese Empire. And it's very clear that the United States is going to be pulled into that world war at some point, sooner rather than later. And so the argument is then, don't you want an experienced leader? Don't you want someone you know and you've known for 8 years, who's helped to lift us out of this worldwide depression? Don't you want that person with all his experience and all of his talents and all of his political traits to be at the helm at this war at time and this crisis in the world? So they talk about that in this broadside, but they also mention Hitler. And they say, wouldn't Hitler like to know that we're changing leadership and we might have a weaker leader coming in? Well, that's pretty powerful. And it was powerful enough to have Roosevelt succeed over even a very strong and good candidate, Wendell Willkie, as we spoke about before.
And I like how they have a lot of bullet points that are about what the founding fathers thought too. So they're like using that as the justification.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Sandy. It's almost, you can see that perhaps there were some lawyers who might have been behind this, making a logical case, but perhaps people who studied constitutional law or studied the founding. And again, there is no precedent for a third term, but there's no precedent in the Constitution or in Supreme Court rulings not to have a third term. So there's some powerful argumentation here as well.
And we have a speech that Roosevelt gave on Memorial Day in Gettysburg. It was before the peace light, so I think it's like 33 or 34, where he's saying Washington would have approved of the New Deal. Like, we're at Gettysburg, but right down the road is Valley Forge. And Washington absolutely would have approved of the New Deal because he believed in the road system. And it's like a 2.5-page speech. But I find it interesting that presidents, especially in the early 20th century, often reached back to Lincoln and to Washington to say they would have supported me and my plans. Is that because they're reaching on the American memory and that sort of like historical memory we all share?
Well, as Lincoln said, as you well know, as a Gettysburg College graduate, the mystic chords of memory. Yeah. They hold us together. And let's face it, 80 to now almost 100 years ago, we were closer in time to Lincoln. We were closer in time even to Washington. So it may have been a bit of an exaggeration to make the case that Washington would have supported fully the New Deal, because presidents in those days, while they could have taken on and did take on a tremendous amount of power, including Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase as an example, and we're always expanding, it seemed, presidential power. They had a sense of the presidency, as is written in the Constitution, that it was not to be so directly related to the people. And it's really, I think, Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, who developed what one scholar has called the rhetorical presidency in the early 20th century. As travel gets easier so that presidents can reach people that way. They can reach them through new media, particularly the radio and then television in the second half of the 20th century. So I can understand why Roosevelt would do that. And by the way, we should also say Democrats would also call upon Jackson and Jefferson, and they would have Democratic parties in every state would have Jefferson-Jackson Day and Jefferson-Jackson Day dinners to raise money for the party. And as we know, Jackson certainly has fallen out of favor with Democrats, and to some extent Jefferson has as well. But Roosevelt and Lincoln continue to maintain their positions despite the slave ownership of Washington.
Yeah. So, Allison, do we have any questions?
We do indeed. And I also wanted to let folks know that I put the speech that Sandy referenced from 1934 Memorial Day into the chat. So check that out. It's a really fantastic speech and goes quite nicely with the theme of tonight's program. So check it out. Our first question comes from Steve, and Steve asks, how much criticism did FDR receive from his decision to run for a third term? And what impacts did war in Europe play in FDR's 1940 presidential election victory?
Well, it depended, Steve, on which side one was on. So if we're looking at the Republicans, we know from the campaign buttons, from the broadsides, there was a lot of criticism that he should break this precedent established by none other than the father of our country, George Washington, and run for a third term. So there was a lot of criticism from that part of the Republican Party, most Republicans, and certainly the business community that called him that man. Eleanor Roosevelt also was not especially popular. It was thought that, much as we remember people criticizing Hillary Clinton for taking on too much power as First Lady, people saw Eleanor Roosevelt, if they didn't care for her, they saw her in that way. So there was a campaign button from the Republicans, similar to the ones you're seeing on the screen, but it said, and we don't want Eleanor either. So they wanted to get rid of her. But I think that the key point for Democrats and for people who were pro-Roosevelt, Eleanor and Franklin, was that yes, the horizon, just on the horizon, was this next great war that we would come to know as World War II. Of course, it would take us to December of 41 and the bombing of Pearl Harbor to push us in fully to that war. And there were a lot of people at that time, as there are now, and who supported Trump's America First approach. There was an America First movement in the 1930s, an isolationist movement that said we'd already been in one world war, we don't want to get into another. And so particularly people on the left did not want to get into another world war. So they were led by Charles Lindbergh. The America First movement was also very right-wing in that sense. Just didn't want us to get into war. So to say, oh, well, Roosevelt will lead us in the next war was not persuasive to some people, but certainly for Democrats, they were fine to have a third run at it, and they hoped a third term for Roosevelt, especially with war on the horizon. And it so happened he proved to be a superb wartime leader, particularly with the Allies led by Winston Churchill, and his vision of the post-war era of a United Nations, of NATO, which I recognize has fallen into some disfavor among some groups, including Trumpists. But one should make the argument that at least from the post-World War II era up until very recently, it meant that we hadn't faced another world war.
Next question comes from Nicole, who asks, I've heard some argue that the New Deal programs didn't pull us out of the Depression, but instead World War II did. Is this accurate?
I think so, with an asterisk by it. I think that that's probably true in economic terms. And as I mentioned earlier, I think most historians would agree with you, Nicole, that it is probably takes the expenditure necessary to fight World War II to lift us completely out of the Great Depression. But I think it's fair to say that, and by the way, there are two segments of the New Deal. And so some are called the first New Deal and some are called the second New Deal. It was such a difficult economic situation and climate catastrophe that it's almost impossible to imagine how simply government programs could have brought us out of it. So it might have just been impossible for the government to get us out fully from the ravages of the Great Depression and the climate crisis. What I think is in Roosevelt's favor for his legacy is that both New Deals, both the first and second segment, some of which failed, some of which were struck down, as I said, by the Supreme Court, but many of which were very, very successful, including the Civilian Conservation Corps, that we have to say that he ameliorated the worst impact of the Great Depression. And as you all know, so much of the economy, including the stock market, is based on how people feel about the economy. If they feel their bank won't collapse, they won't run and do a run on the bank and take out their money. If they feel the stock market is sound, they will put more money into the stock market and invest in business. So to the extent that Roosevelt himself was such a supremely confident, positive person and passed that along to the American people, so helping them during the Depression and World War II, I think that's also in his favor as well, to have helped us along in that Great Depression era, but also knowing that Hoover, as a restraintist president, not an activist, but a passive president, and that was a theory that William Howard Taft had expounded as president. And once he became the Chief Justice of the United States on the Supreme Court in the 1920s, there are some who have a view, a more founders-oriented view of the Constitution. The president should be passive and they should only undertake the powers that they are directly given in the Constitution. Teddy Roosevelt's view was no, presidents should be activists and they should do everything in their power to help the American people and our country unless that power is declined for them by the Supreme Court or it is not given to them in the Constitution, or it is just simply not allowed for them to engage in it. So the fact that this was a very different form of presidency that we see to this day, with the growth of bureaucracy, the growth of the executive branch, and that American people have come to rely on. Roosevelt should be given credit for that too.
Couldn't find that mute button. Our next question comes from Brenda, and Brenda says, "Were most campaign broadsides designed for such close reading? Today's posters, etc., aim to grab attention for about 2 seconds with bright colors, quick slogans, etc. No real information. The older broadside versions apparently assume a literate public. Is this true, or simply a coincidence and not practicing modern ad campaign approaches?"
Oh, well, that question packs so much of an interesting approach to how campaigns were run and the American electorate in those days and now. It's probably safe to say that the American electorate is more literate now. Tocqueville said, the famous Frenchman who went around the country in the 1830s and wrote the famous book, Democracy in America, said he had never seen so many educated people in one country, but so many unlearned people. So again, I think we're probably doing pretty well on the literate side of the equation now, maybe even more so than we were in the 1930s and 40s, just because we have more education, more people go to college, as an example. However, I would say that the attention span of the American people, and maybe around the world, but certainly in the United States, has dropped. And I think this can be proved. They've actually done studies that show that people's attention spans has gone from maybe 1 minute down into the multiple seconds, down into about the 8-second realm. So if somebody has something on a tweet, if somebody has something on TikTok, if somebody's watching something on TV, if someone's reading something on a printed page, you better be very pungent and very succinct in your message, because people will just move on. So I do think that that's a really good point of distinction between what people are willing to spend time with in this day and age. And it is growing, I think, fewer and fewer seconds that they are willing to put into reading a message. So campaign information, it's almost a misnomer to talk about campaign literature these days. I would just say campaign messaging through social media particularly, and Donald Trump proved the expert at that. Short, pungent, pithy, I would say messages that really grab people's attention, sometimes by being outrageous, is clearly the way to go for him. I hope that that does not become the rule for people running for president, but it did prove that it can be successful.
The next question comes from Robert, and Robert says, I'm all for giving FDR credit for his leadership, but these programs were based on legislation enacted by Congress. What was the relationship between FDR and Congress?
Yes, good point. But we don't have a dictatorship, Robert. So we have to say that the president was working within the separation of powers, as some scholars call it, a system of shared powers. And he was able to share power with Congress because he had vast Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate. That was the good news for him. The bad news for him was that about a third of those majorities in the Democratic Party in the House and the Senate were made up of Southern Democrats who were conservative, who were against civil rights. So, for example, Eleanor Roosevelt was constantly going into her husband and saying, can't you support the anti-lynching bill that's in Congress in the 1930s? And he would say, no, I can't, because if I do, I will lose the Southern Democrats. And because the South was a one party Democratic Party state, it meant that in the seniority system in Congress, the leadership was held by Democrats and Southern Democrats in the Congress. So there was a problem there that faced FDR. You are right to say that he had to come up with his ideas. And he wasn't just the only person. He had what was called his brain trust. He had the best and the brightest before Kennedy did. People from academia, people like Felix Frankfurter at Harvard Law School, who ended up one of his appointees to the Supreme Court. So he had brilliant people around him who helped to develop programs. And then his view was, if a program did work, scrap it and move on to the next. But he couldn't, except through executive orders, just through the stroke of a pen, say, we're going to eliminate the Great Depression and here are all of my regulations. No, they had to go through Congress. And then, as I mentioned earlier, more than a dozen of them in the first term were overturned, struck down by the Supreme Court, which gave him apoplexy because no members of the court left in his first term. No one died and no one retired. So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with his court packing plan that did not succeed. So as my wonderful mentor here at the University of Virginia, Henry Abraham, used to say, FDR had to pack the court the old-fashioned way. He ended up putting 9 members, all 9 members, including the Chief Justice on, but he had to wait for justices to retire or leave. So he had trouble with Congress on occasion because of the Southern conservatives. And he attempted, by the way, to purge some of the conservatives from his party in the 1938 midterms. And that backfired on him. And that and the attempt to pack the court, as I said, even among some liberals and liberal newspapers, sometimes turned against him to say, you're too clever by half, Franklin. And they would turn against him.
This final question comes from Christine, who asks, what factors primarily contributed to the constitutional amendment limiting presidential terms?
Yes, Christine, that in a word, Franklin. The people who were not happy with his being elected 4 times and viewing him as a dictator, again, primarily Republicans, but I think some Democrats even became a bit concerned about that it violated the precedents of our great Washington and all the other great presidents before Roosevelt. It was just viewed as something that should be done away with as a possibility. And so the fact that, again, in 1947, the Congress passes the amendment and then it goes to the states and it is affirmed by the states in the early 1950s and is there to this day. We still don't have notice term limits for members of Congress. Every now and again, there are attempts to do that. Newt Gingrich's Contract with America in 1994. In those midterm elections, one of those was term limits for Congress. Those have not passed through Congress. You can imagine, I think, why that's the case. And I think some Republicans may have rued the day of the 22nd Amendment in the Reagan era. Reagan was so popular in his 2 terms, he could have won a 3rd term. Certainly, Barack Obama could have won a 3rd term, it seems. So I think that there are those who might rue the day and wish they could go back to, and they could repeal that amendment, but I doubt that would go through. I think there are those who might have said maybe the founders were right, that there shouldn't have been term limits placed on presidents.
Right. Well, thank you, Barbara. That's been amazing. We are going to ask Allison to tell us about some upcoming programs.
Indeed. So our next session of Inside the Vault is September 1st, Thursday, as always. 7 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll be joined by Professor H.W. Brands from UT Austin, talking about the 1836 Texas Declaration of Independence. So absolutely join us for that. It'll be a great conversation. Book Breaks is taking place this Sunday, August 7th at 2 p.m. Faye Yarbrough will be discussing her book, Choctaw Confederates, the American Civil War in Indian Country. And we want you to sign up for courses in our MA program. It is a fantastic program. Applications are now open for that program in collaboration between GLI and Gettysburg College. Registration for this fall semester is open until the 28th of September. All of the links that we're discussing here are in the chat. Madison is putting all of them in right now. And you will be getting this program recording, the slide presentation, and all of the links and other things as well in an email tomorrow. It'll be in your inbox by about 12 o'clock Eastern time. So if you are not getting our emails, there's a very strong chance that your server, maybe if you're a teacher or something, is blocking our email. So try a different email address and email us at collectionprograms@gilderlehrman.org, and we'll get you all of your stuff that you've been missing. And as always, you can view the full archive of our programs on our website. I'll pop the link in the chat, and it is also in the email coming to you tomorrow. So I know some people think that maybe the recording is expired after the week, but that's not true. That's just the Zoom link. You can view the recording for free, always for free. It was available on our website. So they're always there for you. But again, if you have questions, send us an email.
I'm also going to chime in with Book Breaks is an absolutely free program for students and teachers. So check that out. There's a lot of great historians talking about their most recent work. So it's a really good program. I'm also going to give a little bit of a shout out for the October Inside the Vault, which is going to be with Professor Michael Berkner of Gettysburg College, talking about Eisenhower and his views on Vietnam in 1968. So very special one. Dr. Berkner was my college advisor, so we're looking forward to working with him on the program. And Barbara, I want to say thank you for joining us tonight. It's always a pleasure to work with you and to hear not only the history, but weave it into the humanity of the time period. You really humanize what's going on and bring it down to that personal level. And I think that's what students really enjoy in school too. Like, we can read the facts and figures in books, but it's those stories about how it really impacted people that make a difference.
Well, Sandy and Allison and Madison and everyone at GLI, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure and honor. And for those who participated with questions, thank you for those. They were superb. And I think I'm doing a book break in October, I believe it is, on my book on Jacqueline Kennedy. So I hope to see some of you again, and certainly through my teaching at GLI, and particularly coming up for the MA program. So thanks to everyone, and for all that GLI, all that you do for promoting American history in this country. We now more than ever, I think, need to be able to look back and see where we've come from in order to know where we're going.
Absolutely. And with that, I want to wish everybody a good night, and we'll see you next month. Thank you.
Here.